He had always loved music. Even when life had been difficult and money was scarce, the piano was the one thing that made him feel free. His apartment was small, with cracked walls and a single window that barely let in sunlight, but in the corner stood a worn-out upright piano. The keys were chipped, and the pedals squeaked when pressed, yet it was his treasure. Every day, he would sit at it, letting his fingers glide over the keys, creating melodies that no one outside the room seemed to notice. Most people passed him by without a second glance. When he played on the streets, in small parks, or outside cafes, people would throw him sidelong glances, whisper to each other, or sometimes laugh. He could feel their eyes, judging him for his ragged clothes and unkempt hair. But when he played, none of that mattered. Music was his language, and in that language, he could express things that words could never capture. He remembered a time when he was a child, sitting in a dusty music room at a local community center. An old piano teacher had noticed his eagerness and raw talent, telling him that he had a gift. From that day, he had dreamed of playing on grand stages, with audiences that would listen and feel his music. But life had other plans. His family struggled to make ends meet, and he had to leave school early to work odd jobs, barely making enough to rent the small apartment he now called home. Even so, he never stopped practicing. Each day after work, he would sit at his piano and play for hours. Sometimes, the notes would be soft and sad, reflecting the heaviness of his life. Other times, they would be lively and hopeful, almost as if he were telling the world that he refused to be defeated. He played for himself first, but slowly he noticed that even a few people passing by would pause, just for a moment, to listen. One cold morning, he decided to take his piano to the park, the only place where he could play publicly without being asked to leave. The piano was heavy and scratched from years of moving, but he managed to place it near a bench under a large oak tree. He wrapped his thin coat tightly around himself and began to play. His fingers, despite the chill, moved gracefully over the keys. People walked by quickly, talking on their phones or hurrying to work. Some sneered at him, whispering about how he looked or how he could even think of playing in such poor conditions. A group of teenagers stopped near the piano. They laughed loudly at the sight of him, pointing at his worn shoes and the frayed edges of his coat. One of them made a mocking gesture, pretending to play an invisible piano with exaggerated movements. The laughter stung, but he didn't stop. He kept playing, letting the music flow as if it were a shield against their ridicule. The melody was beautiful and soft, almost as if it were pleading with them to see the beauty in what they mocked. After a while, a few people began to notice something different. An elderly woman leaning on a cane stopped and listened. A young child tugged at her mother's sleeve, pointing at the pianist with wide eyes. There was a strange power in the music, a quiet command that forced people to pay attention, even if they didn't want to. The laughter of the teenagers slowly faded as they too found themselves caught in the melody, though they would not admit it aloud. Despite this small attention, the pianist felt the weight of the world pressing down on him. He knew that most people would never understand his struggles or his dreams. Money was always a problem. Sometimes he would go days without enough food, and the thought of his unpaid rent always lingered in the back of his mind. Friends were few, as most people drifted away when life got hard. But the piano never judged him, never asked for anything except his dedication. And in return, it gave him a voice that could reach beyond poverty, beyond ridicule, beyond everything that tried to hold him down. He often thought about the life he might have had if circumstances were different. Perhaps he would have studied at a music school, played in orchestras, or performed in grand concert halls. But even in his imagination, he never stopped playing in his small apartment or on the street. There was a purity to it, a truth that he felt when the music rose from his fingers. It was his own world, and for a few moments each day, he could escape the harsh reality around him. Sometimes people would approach him after a performance, offering small amounts of money, a kind word, or even just a smile. Those moments meant more than anything else. They were proof that someone had seen him, really seen him, and appreciated what he had to offer. It was these moments that kept him going, even when the world seemed cruel and indifferent. On one particular evening, As the sun was setting and casting golden light across the park, he began to play a piece he had composed himself. The notes were full of sorrow and hope intertwined, a reflection of a life lived on the edge but never surrendered. The people passing by slowed down. Their footsteps faltered. Phones were lowered. The sound was soft but insistent, reaching into hearts without permission. Even the teenagers who had laughed earlier stopped, their faces showing a hint of surprise and awe. For the pianist, this was the most important part of his day. It wasn't about fame or recognition, though he dreamed of it. It was about the connection that music could create, the invisible thread that could tie strangers together for a brief moment. It was a reminder that no matter how small or overlooked a person might be, their passion could touch others in ways words never could. As the sky darkened and the first stars appeared, he finished the piece and let his hands rest on the keys. Silence followed, a silence heavier than any noise before it. Some people clapped quietly, a few whispered words of admiration, but most simply walked away, carrying a piece of his music with them without even knowing it. He smiled faintly, knowing that he had done what he could that day, that he had given his music to the world even when the world had given little to him. Back in his small apartment that night, he sat by the window and looked out at the city lights. The piano stood in the corner, silent now, but full of promise for tomorrow. He knew that life would continue to be hard, that the laughter and mockery might come again, but he also knew that he had something stronger than ridicule. His music, his unwavering love for it, and the rare, fleeting moments when someone truly listened. And in that knowledge, he found a quiet strength that kept him going, one note at a time. The day started like any other, with the pianist waking up before dawn. The apartment was cold, the floorboards creaking under his feet as he moved to the piano. He played a few quiet notes to wake himself up, the sound soft and fragile in the empty room. He had learned long ago that mornings were the best time to practice, before the city woke and before people had opinions about him to distract him. He had a small notebook, worn and patched with tape, filled with ideas, melodies, and half-finished songs. Today, he opened it to a new page, determined to create something that would reach beyond the street corners, beyond the park benches, and into the hearts of those who didn't know the struggles of a man who played from nothing but hope and love. He packed up his few belongings and headed out, dragging the old piano to the park, his fingers brushing the keys for a moment as if saying a quiet hello before the performance. The streets were already waking up, people moving quickly, their eyes fixed on their destinations. Some glanced at him and shook their heads, muttering under their breath about why anyone would play in public without proper clothes or recognition. By the time he reached the park, a small crowd had begun to gather near the usual spots where he played. Some were regulars, old men on benches who appreciated music more than talk, a few children who would sit on the ground and listen without understanding why it moved them. Today, however, there were new faces. People who had heard the mockery and curiosity pulled them closer. As he began to play, the notes floated into the chilly morning air, soft at first, like whispers. The melody was delicate, full of the subtle sadness that had grown from years of hardship, yet threaded with hope. The teenagers from the other day appeared again, leaning against a nearby tree, smirking. One of them even made a show of yawning, rolling their eyes, trying to appear uninterested. The pianist continued, unfazed. He had learned that the best way to respond to laughter was with focus, letting his music speak louder than words ever could. With each note, he poured his soul into the piano, telling stories of nights spent hungry, days spent unnoticed, and dreams that refused to die. The music was not loud, but it had a strange pull, a quiet force that drew people closer without demanding attention. A young mother sat down on a nearby bench, holding her child. She had heard him before, but had never stopped long enough to listen fully. Today, something about the way he played made her pause. The child tugged at her sleeve, fascinated by the flowing hands and the sound that seemed to speak of both pain and joy. Even the teenagers found themselves stopping, their earlier laughter fading as the music wrapped around them like a gentle tide. Then something remarkable happened. A man, older, well-dressed, and clearly in a hurry, slowed down, his briefcase tucked under one arm. He listened quietly, his eyes narrowing as if trying to understand where the music came from and why it touched him. He was soon joined by another person, then another. Slowly, the small crowd that had gathered began to grow, yet no one spoke. The music commanded silence, not out of fear, but out of respect for the skill and passion flowing from the pianist's hands. The pianist, unaware of how deeply he had captured their attention, played with more intensity. His fingers danced across the worn keys, creating moments that seemed impossible for someone with so little. Every chord was precise, every pause meaningful. The melody told the story of life on the margins, a life where dreams were fragile yet fiercely held. It spoke of nights alone, of meals skipped, of work done in silence, and of the longing for recognition that might never come. Yet it also spoke of resilience, of refusing to surrender, and of finding beauty in even the smallest joys. By the time he paused, the crowd was silent. Even the teenagers who had mocked him earlier were still, looking at the piano with a mixture of awe and confusion. The young mother clutched her child, tears welling in her eyes, overwhelmed by the purity and honesty of the music. The older man adjusted his tie, staring at the pianist with admiration he didn't know how to express. But with the attention came the sting of reality. Someone in the crowd whispered loudly, "Why is he playing on the street? He should be in a concert hall." Others nodded, murmuring agreement. It was a reminder that society often rewarded wealth, status, and appearances, not the quiet brilliance of someone like him. The pianist felt the weight of their eyes, judging not his music, but his life. He took a deep breath and began another piece, slower this time, more introspective. The notes were tinged with sadness, reflecting the humiliation and judgment he had faced. He did not play for approval. He played to tell the truth of his life. Slowly, the crowd began to feel it. Even those who had whispered criticism felt themselves moved, their hearts softening in ways they did not expect. A small boy, no more than 7 or 8, stepped forward from the back of the crowd. He had been watching intently, his eyes wide and curious. When the pianist noticed him, he smiled gently and continued playing, letting the child see the joy that could come from expressing oneself through music. The boy clapped softly at the end of the piece, his innocence and pure appreciation cutting through the cloud of judgment surrounding the pianist. As the day wore on, the pianist played several more pieces, each different in tone and emotion. The crowd fluctuated, people coming and going, but the connection remained. Some stayed for the entire morning, unable to pull themselves away from the music that seemed to touch something deep inside. Others stopped briefly, leaving with a sense of wonder, carrying the memory of the music into their daily lives. Yet, even in this small victory, the pianist knew his life was far from easy. He returned home with little money, tired and hungry, but filled with a sense of accomplishment. He knew he had made a difference for those who had listened closely, even if only for a moment. He played again at home that evening, letting the piano take the weight off his shoulders, pouring the experiences of the day into a new composition. It was a mixture of joy, sorrow, and hope, the very essence of his life. He thought about the people who had laughed at him, the ones who had whispered and judged. He realized that they were part of the journey he had chosen. Their laughter did not diminish his music. If anything, it made it stronger. Each performance was not just about talent. It was about resilience, determination, and refusing to let the world define his worth. As night fell, the city outside quieted, and the pianist sat at his piano, letting his fingers move gently across the keys. He played for the small group of friends he had, the elderly neighbors who nodded in appreciation, the children who clapped softly, and the rare passerby who stopped and listened. In those moments, he felt seen, not as a poor man on the street, but as an artist, a storyteller, and a human being who refused to surrender his dreams. In the end, it was not about fame or recognition. It was about the truth in his music, the way it could reach into hearts and minds without asking for permission. He understood that the laughter, the mockery, and the judgment would always be there, but so would the music. And as long as he had his piano, his talent, and his unbroken spirit, he would continue to play, hoping that one day, someone would truly understand the depth of what he had to offer. The pianist woke up early as usual, the city still quiet and the streets empty except for the occasional jogger or dog walker. He sat by his piano in the dim light, the worn keys staring back at him like old friends. Today felt different. There was a quiet anticipation in the air, as if the music itself knew that something new was about to happen. He opened his notebook, flipping through pages of melodies he had composed over the years, each carrying a piece of his heart. He had been working on a composition that was unlike anything he had played before. It was complex, full of delicate nuances and sudden bursts of emotion. The music was a reflection of his life. Moments of sorrow intertwined with flashes of hope, quiet introspection followed by sudden passion. He played slowly at first, letting each note find its place, shaping the piece as if he were sculpting it with sound. After hours of practice, he felt ready. He decided to take the piano to a slightly different part of the city, one he had never performed in before. It was a busy square near a small theater, a place where people often hurried past without noticing anything but their own schedules. Today he would try something new. He wanted to see if his music could break through the walls of indifference that surrounded him. Setting up his piano was always a challenge, but he moved carefully, placing it in a spot where the sunlight caught the edges of the keys, making them glow faintly. People began to pass by, some curious, some uninterested. The usual mix of skepticism and brief attention followed him wherever he went. He noticed the subtle whispers, the glances that judged him before he played a single note. It was nothing new, but it never got easier. He began to play. The notes started softly, almost like a secret shared between him and the world. Slowly, the music grew, unfolding like a story with chapters that revealed themselves one after another. People stopped to listen, drawn by the strange pull of the melody. There was something in the way he played that felt different from the usual street performances. A depth, an intensity that reached into the heart without demanding permission. A small crowd formed, some sitting on the steps nearby, others standing with their arms crossed, unsure if they wanted to be touched by the music or resist it. Among them was an elderly man with a cane, someone who had clearly seen much of life's hardships. He watched silently, his eyes narrowing in concentration, as if he were trying to understand not just the music, but the man who played it. The pianist was unaware of the growing audience. He was lost in the music, letting each note carry the weight of his experiences. He thought about the nights spent hungry, the days spent working menial jobs, and the countless times he had been laughed at or ignored. All of that poured into the melody, giving it a life of its own. The music was no longer just sound. It was a bridge between him and the people around him, a connection that transcended words and appearances. Children gathered near the front, drawn to the energy of the performance. Their laughter and wide-eyed curiosity softened the mood, adding a gentle contrast to the intense emotions in the composition. Even the skeptics found themselves listening more closely, their judgment suspended as the music wrapped around them, tugging at feelings they hadn't expected to confront. The pianist noticed a young woman standing at the back of the crowd, holding a notebook of her own. She scribbled quickly as she listened, capturing impressions, emotions, and fragments of the melody. Her presence intrigued him, though he did not pause. The music demanded his full attention. Somehow, he felt that she understood, in a way others did not, that this was not just a performance but a revelation. Hours passed, though it felt like minutes. The music built, each phrase more intricate than the last, each chord resonating with honesty and passion. The crowd was silent now, mesmerized. The teenagers who had mocked him before had disappeared, perhaps too shy or too humbled to return. The people who remained were caught in a delicate balance between awe and disbelief, unable to look away even if they wanted to. As the final notes of the piece lingered in the air, a hush fell over the square. It was the kind of silence that speaks louder than applause, a silence that reflects respect, wonder, and a deep acknowledgement of talent. The pianist sat quietly, letting the last vibrations fade, feeling a rare sense of fulfillment. He had shared a part of himself that no words could express, and for once, he sensed that it had reached those who truly mattered. After the performance, the young woman approached him cautiously. She introduced herself as a writer who wanted to capture real stories, stories that reflected life in its rawest form. She told him how the music had moved her, how it had made her feel connected to a life she had never experienced. The pianist smiled, a quiet, humble smile, knowing that her understanding was one of the few validations he truly sought. She asked if she could come back the next day to hear more, perhaps even write about him. He agreed, not for fame or recognition, but because he saw a chance to reach more hearts, to tell his story in a way that words alone could never achieve. He realized that sometimes, it took a witness who could carry the music beyond the immediate moment, someone who could translate the unspoken into shared understanding. That evening, back in his small apartment, he played again, this time letting the composition unfold without concern for anyone outside. The music was private, intimate, a conversation between himself and the piano. He reflected on the day, on the faces of those who had listened, and on the young woman who had seen beyond the surface. It gave him hope, a sense that perhaps the world was ready to listen if one had the courage to play truthfully. He understood more clearly than ever that his music had power. Not power over others, but the power to reveal truth, to touch souls, to create connection where none seemed possible. The laughter, the mockery, the judgments, they were part of the process, inevitable obstacles that could either weaken a person or strengthen them. For him, they had become fuel, driving him to practice harder, play deeper, and reach further. As the night deepened, he placed his hands on the keys and played a quiet, simple melody, one that reflected the calm after a day of emotional intensity. He imagined the faces of the people in the square, the writer who had taken notice, and the children whose laughter had punctuated the music. The piano, worn and scratched, responded faithfully, carrying every note with care and attention. He thought about the future. Perhaps one day he would play in larger venues, before audiences who had no preconceptions or prejudices. Perhaps he would be recognized, not just for talent but for the courage it took to play against the odds. But even if that day never came, he knew that his music had already reached those who needed it most, even in fleeting moments. The composition he was working on remained unfinished, yet it had grown stronger with each day of practice and performance. It was a living testament to his life, a mirror of his struggles, his hopes, and his resilience. And in that living music, he found a quiet satisfaction, a reassurance that he was on the right path, that he had a purpose that extended beyond money, fame, or approval. Finally, as he closed the piano cover and blew out the single candle in his apartment, he felt a sense of peace. The city outside was asleep, unaware of the small triumphs that had occurred in quiet corners, in public squares, and in the hearts of those who had truly listened. He lay down, tired but content, knowing that the journey was far from over, but that each note, each melody, each small audience brought him closer to the moment when his music would finally speak to the world in full. The morning was crisp, and the city streets glowed under the soft light of dawn. The pianist prepared to take his piano to a new location, a larger square near a theater district, where the flow of people was constant and the chances of being noticed were higher. He moved the piano carefully, each step measured to avoid scraping the worn wood against the pavement. Despite the weight and the effort, he felt a quiet thrill in his chest, a sense that something important was about to happen. He arranged the piano in a corner where the sunlight highlighted the edges of the keys, creating a natural spotlight. People passed by, some curious, some indifferent, but the pianist paid them no mind. His focus was entirely on the music, on the story he was about to tell through the notes that had been living in his mind for weeks. This piece was special, a culmination of everything he had learned, felt, and endured over the years. It was his most personal work, a reflection of both hardship and hope. He began to play, starting softly, almost like a whisper, drawing people in gradually. The music was intricate and emotional, filled with subtle shifts that mirrored the complexity of human experience. The notes were deliberate, each one telling a part of a story that went beyond words. Passers-by slowed down, intrigued by the depth of the sound, the unexpected richness from such a small, seemingly unremarkable pianist. At first, only a few people stopped, leaning against nearby walls or sitting on benches. Then more began to gather, sensing that this was no ordinary street performance. The atmosphere changed as the music grew in intensity and passion. It was not loud or showy, but it held a commanding presence, capturing attention effortlessly. Even those who had never cared for piano music found themselves drawn in, unable to ignore the emotion that filled the space. Among the crowd were faces he recognized, some who had laughed before, some who had quietly listened. Their expressions changed as the music unfolded, disbelief giving way to awe. The teenagers from earlier appearances stood at the edge, their earlier mockery replaced by reluctant admiration. They shifted uncomfortably, realizing that the man they had mocked was capable of something extraordinary. The pianist played with complete immersion. He was aware of the growing crowd but did not let it distract him. Each chord was a declaration, each melody a story. The music spoke of days spent struggling, of nights alone, of dreams deferred. Yet it also sang of resilience, courage, and the beauty of persistence. It was as if the piano had become an extension of his soul, transmitting his emotions directly into the hearts of the listeners. Children gathered at the front, their wide eyes reflecting both curiosity and wonder. One little girl, clutching a small doll, tilted her head, mesmerized by the movement of his fingers and the emotion in every note. A man standing nearby wiped a tear from his eye, moved by the purity of the music. The pianist noticed them but did not falter. The performance was a conversation, not a performance for approval or praise. As the piece reached its climax, the crowd was completely captivated. Even the skeptics were silent, held in a state of quiet reverence by the power of the music. Every rise and fall of the melody seemed to echo the highs and lows of life, the struggles and small triumphs that define human existence. It was impossible not to be affected, even for those who had initially passed by without interest. At the conclusion, the pianist allowed the final notes to linger, holding the silence like a breath. The square was filled with a quiet that felt almost sacred. No one moved, no one spoke for several moments, the weight of the performance settling in. Then, slowly, applause began, hesitant at first, then growing steadily. The sound was not just appreciation for skill but acknowledgement of truth, a recognition of the life and emotion poured into every note. The teenagers who had mocked him earlier stood awkwardly at the back, clapping quietly, unsure of how to react. The elderly man with the cane who had watched silently in previous performances stepped forward, nodding with approval and respect. The young mother with her child, who had watched from a distance, now smiled warmly, feeling that the music had touched something she could not explain. The writer who had visited the day before jotted notes furiously, capturing the impact and the transformation unfolding before her eyes. For the pianist, this moment was unlike any other. He had experienced small recognitions before, brief glimpses of attention, but this was different. The collective acknowledgement, the shared emotion of the crowd, validated everything he had endured. It was a turning point, a moment where the mockery and doubt were replaced by genuine appreciation. Yet he remained humble, letting the music speak louder than any self-congratulation could. As people lingered, some asking questions, others offering small tokens of appreciation, he realized the power of persistence. The road had been difficult, filled with loneliness and judgment, but the music had carried him forward, creating connections where there had been none. It was proof that talent and dedication could overcome prejudice, that the truth of one's abilities could eventually break through even the hardest of hearts. Later, as the sun began to lower and cast long shadows across the square, the pianist packed up his piano with care. People approached to express their gratitude, share their admiration, or simply to say that they had been moved. Each interaction, however brief, reinforced the sense that he was no longer invisible, that his music had the power to stop people in their tracks and change the way they saw the world, even for a moment. Walking home, he reflected on the day. The city seemed different now, not in its streets or buildings, but in the energy that lingered from the performance. He understood that recognition could be fleeting, that not everyone would notice or care, But he also knew that the truth of his music could never be denied. It existed in him, in his fingers, in the piano, and in the hearts of those who had truly listened. That night, back in his apartment, he played again, this time in solitude. The melodies were softer, more introspective, allowing him to process the emotions of the day. He thought of the faces in the crowd, the silent acknowledgments, the tears, the smiles, and even the lingering doubts. Each of these experiences became part of the music, adding depth and authenticity that could never be replicated in a grand concert hall. It was a reminder that true art came from honesty, from the courage to express oneself despite the world's indifference. He thought about the journey ahead. There would be more challenges, more ridicule, and more obstacles. Yet he felt ready, strengthened by the knowledge that his music had the power to touch people in profound ways. The laughter of those who had doubted him no longer hurt. It had become part of the story, part of the music itself. Every note he played was a testament to resilience, an invitation to listeners to pause, feel, and reflect. As he closed the piano cover and looked out the window at the sleeping city, he felt a quiet satisfaction. Today had been a victory, not because of fame or wealth, but because he had stayed true to himself and shared his gift without compromise. He knew that the journey was far from over, that greater challenges and opportunities awaited, but he also understood that he had reached a pivotal moment. His music had finally stopped people in their tracks, had forced them to listen, and had spoken a truth that could not be ignored. He lay down that night with a sense of calm, knowing that tomorrow, and the days after, the piano would once again become his voice, his companion, and his bridge to the world. The recognition he had gained today was a spark, a sign that persistence and dedication could overcome adversity. And in that spark, he found hope, a guiding light that would carry him forward through the trials yet to come, always letting his music speak louder than words. At the conclusion, the pianist allowed the final notes to linger, holding the silence like a breath. The square was filled with a quiet that felt almost sacred. No one moved, no one spoke for several moments, the weight of the performance settling in. Then, slowly, applause began, hesitant at first, then growing steadily. The sound was not just appreciation for skill but acknowledgement of truth, a recognition of the life and emotion poured into every note. The teenagers who had mocked him earlier stood awkwardly at the back, clapping quietly, unsure of how to react. The elderly man with the cane who had watched silently in previous performances stepped forward, nodding with approval and respect. The young mother with her child, who had watched from a distance, now smiled warmly, feeling that the music had touched something she could not explain. The writer who had visited the day before jotted notes furiously, capturing the impact and the transformation unfolding before her eyes. For the pianist, this moment was unlike any other. He had experienced small recognitions before, brief glimpses of attention, but this was different. The collective acknowledgement, the shared emotion of the crowd, validated everything he had endured. It was a turning point, a moment where the mockery and doubt were replaced by genuine appreciation. Yet he remained humble, letting the music speak louder than any self-congratulation could. As people lingered, some asking questions, others offering small tokens of appreciation, he realized the power of persistence. The road had been difficult, filled with loneliness and judgment, but the music had carried him forward, creating connections where there had been none. It was proof that talent and dedication could overcome prejudice, that the truth of one's abilities could eventually break through even the hardest of hearts. Later, as the sun began to lower and cast long shadows across the square, the pianist packed up his piano with care. People approached to express their gratitude, share their admiration, or simply to say that they had been moved. Each interaction, however brief, reinforced the sense that he was no longer invisible, that his music had the power to stop people in their tracks and change the way they saw the world, even for a moment. Walking home, he reflected on the day. The city seemed different now, not in its streets or buildings, but in the energy that lingered from the performance. He understood that recognition could be fleeting, that not everyone would notice or care, but he also knew that the truth of his music could never be denied. It existed in him, in his fingers, in the piano, and in the hearts of those who had truly listened. That night, back in his apartment, he played again, this time in solitude. The melodies were softer, more introspective, allowing him to process the emotions of the day. He thought of the faces in the crowd, the silent acknowledgments, the tears, the smiles, and even the lingering doubts. Each of these experiences became part of the music, adding depth and authenticity that could never be replicated in a grand concert hall. It was a reminder that true art came from honesty, from the courage to express oneself despite the world's indifference. He thought about the journey ahead. There would be more challenges, more ridicule, and more obstacles. Yet he felt ready, strengthened by the knowledge that his music had the power to touch people in profound ways. The laughter of those who had doubted him no longer hurt. It had become part of the story, part of the music itself. Every note he played was a testament to resilience, an invitation to listeners to pause, feel, and reflect. As he closed the piano cover and looked out the window at the sleeping city, he felt a quiet satisfaction. Today had been a victory, not because of fame or wealth, but because he had stayed true to himself and shared his gift without compromise. He knew that the journey was far from over, that greater challenges and opportunities awaited, but he also understood that he had reached a pivotal moment. His music had finally stopped people in their tracks, had forced them to listen, and had spoken a truth that could not be ignored. He lay down that night with a sense of calm, knowing that tomorrow, and the days after, the piano would once again become his voice, his companion, and his bridge to the world. The recognition he had gained today was a spark, a sign that persistence and dedication could overcome adversity. And in that spark, he found hope, a guiding light that would carry him forward through the trials yet to come, always letting his music speak louder than words. The day began with a quiet sense of anticipation. The pianist had received an unexpected message from a local music club. A small concert venue had heard of his street performances and invited him to play in front of a seated audience, not just passers-by. Though the venue was modest, it represented a chance to share his music on a more serious stage. He packed up his piano carefully, feeling a mixture of nervousness and excitement. This was new territory, a test of whether his talent could hold up beyond the street, beyond the casual listeners, and reach people who came with expectations. Arriving at the venue, he noticed the contrast from the streets he was used to. The hall was tidy and quiet, with chairs arranged in rows and soft lighting that made the room feel intimate. People filled the seats, their expressions curious and polite. There was no laughter, no whispers of mockery. Instead, there was anticipation, a shared sense of respect for the music that was about to begin. The pianist felt a surge of energy. For the first time, he would play without distraction, without judgment, and his full attention went to the piano in front of him. He began softly, letting the first notes fill the room with a gentle resonance. The audience leaned in, captivated by the skill and emotion in every chord. The piece he chose was one of his most personal compositions, a reflection of the struggles and joys that had shaped his life. Each movement told a story, the hardships of poverty, the moments of doubt and humiliation, the rare flickers of kindness and recognition. But within the sorrow was hope, a reminder that even in the darkest times, music could shine a light. As the performance continued, the pianist felt a shift. The audience was not just listening. They were experiencing the story behind the notes. He could see people closing their eyes, lost in the music, feeling what he had felt and understanding, in some small way, the life he had lived. A woman in the front row dabbed at her eyes, moved to tears by the raw honesty of the piece. An older man nodded slowly, appreciation written clearly on his face. Even a few teenagers, brought along by parents, sat quietly, awed by the depth of emotion. The music swelled, rising and falling like waves, carrying both tension and release. The pianist's fingers flew across the keys with precision, but every note carried feeling, a direct line from his heart to the audience. For him, it was not about fame or applause. It was about connection, about using his gift to reach others in the most honest way possible. In the past, people had laughed or ignored him. Today, they were listening, truly listening, and it was more powerful than anything he had imagined. When the final notes faded, silence filled the room for a moment that felt almost sacred. Then the audience erupted into applause, not just polite clapping but a genuine outpouring of admiration and respect. Some people stood, cheering, while others wiped away tears. The pianist took a quiet bow, humbled by the reaction. It was a moment of validation, not because he had finally achieved fame, but because he had been seen, truly seen, for the first time by a crowd who understood the depth of his talent. After the performance, people approached him to express their appreciation. Some spoke about how the music had moved them, others asked questions about the stories behind the compositions. A few offered opportunities, invites to play at other venues, requests for collaborations, even mentions of local media coverage. Each interaction was a small acknowledgement of the talent that had long been overlooked. The pianist accepted their words and gestures with humility, grateful for the recognition but aware that it was the music itself, not the praise, that mattered most. He left the venue feeling a sense of fulfillment unlike anything he had experienced before. Walking through the quiet streets, the piano carefully transported on a cart, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The laughter, the mockery, the indifference of strangers. All of it had been part of the path, shaping his resilience and strengthening his resolve. He realized that those hardships had prepared him for this moment, had given the music its depth, its honesty, its ability to touch others so profoundly. Back in his apartment that night, he played again, not for an audience but for himself. The notes flowed easily, carrying the satisfaction of the day, the memories of street corners and park benches, the faces of those who had listened and been moved. He thought about the young woman who had written about him, the children who had clapped with wide-eyed wonder, the elderly listeners who had nodded in quiet approval. Each of these moments contributed to the music, making it richer, fuller, and more meaningful. Over the next few weeks, the pianist continued to play in both public spaces and small venues. He received invitations to perform at local events, and slowly, people began to recognize him not just as the poor man with a worn piano, but as a gifted artist whose music could move hearts. The transformation was gradual, but each step was significant. He remained humble, aware that true success was not in fame or wealth, but in the ability to reach others through honesty and dedication. The pianist never forgot the moments of ridicule and judgment. They remained part of his story, reminders of how far he had come and how resilience could overcome adversity. Yet he also cherished the small gestures of kindness and appreciation, the coins tossed into his case by strangers, the smiles of children, the encouraging words from those who had truly listened. These moments were proof that connection and understanding could exist even in the most unexpected places. One evening, as he played a quiet melody by his window, he reflected on the journey of his life. The music had been both a refuge and a bridge, a way to cope with hardships and a means to reach out to the world. It had taken courage to continue playing despite mockery and indifference, but the rewards had been profound. He had discovered that true artistry was not measured by wealth, fame, or social approval, but by the ability to express truth and touch the hearts of others. He realized that the music would continue to evolve, just as he would continue to grow. There would be more performances, more challenges, more opportunities to connect with people in meaningful ways. But he also understood that the essence of his journey lay not in the destination, but in the act of playing, in the dedication to his craft, and in the moments when his music could stop people in their tracks, make them listen and move them deeply. The pianist sat quietly at the end of the night, letting the piano's presence fill the apartment with a gentle resonance. He smiled, knowing that he had stayed true to his passion, that he had refused to let the judgments of others define him. In that music, he had found freedom, connection, and purpose. It was a reminder that perseverance, honesty, and dedication could transform a life, create opportunities, and touch countless hearts. As he finally closed the piano cover and prepared for sleep, he felt a profound sense of peace. The city outside was quiet, unaware of the small triumphs of a destitute pianist who had refused to give up. He understood that life would continue to bring challenges, but he was ready. With music as his companion, his expression, and his voice, he could navigate any hardship. He knew that one day, more people would listen, more would understand, and more hearts would be moved by the melodies he poured from his soul. And in that knowledge, he found contentment, a quiet satisfaction that no laughter or mockery could ever take away. He had discovered the truth of his journey, that the music, born from struggle and nurtured by hope, had the power to stop people, to change them, and to make the world pause and listen. And that, above all, was worth every moment of hardship he had endured.